Chapter 3. It has been some time since the two of us went on an excursion together like this. With the war going on, these precious moments of respite to enjoy with loved ones are far and few between. I am honored you have chosen me to accompany you during your day of leisure. Ferdinand beamed. Streamers of light had slipped through the canopy of leaves overhead, creating blazing highlights in the bright copper hair. His posture, which had become rigid and tense, like the string of a lute pulled too tight, from weeks of working himself ragged, had eased into a level of comfort one could only achieve when one drops their guard entirely. Joy seemed to radiate from the holy night in cascading waves. Hubert could not help but feel himself returning the smile as he saw the way the other man's face lit up, that damnable fluttering sensation in his chest that he had tried to quench many times had resurged at Ferdinand's use of the phrase loved ones. Obtaining the short leave had been simple enough. Lady Edelgard had been begging both he and Ferdinand to take some time to relax before they both passed out from scrambling to complete their respective, ever-growing mountains of tasks. It would not be long before the army would be marching north into the kingdom. Every one of Her Majesty's soldiers needed to be at their best. Well, someone has to ensure that the heir to House Eyre does not overwork his bones into dust trying to complete a list of duties that were intended to be spread among half a dozen soldiers. Hubert chuckled. It would do Her Majesty's army no good if one of its most esteemed holy knights collapsed during our march across Fargus. That is certainly berating the kettle of being made of the same material. Ferdinand laughed. You two have been wearing yourself past the point of exhaustion as well. Do not think I have forgotten about you dozing off during Constance's proposal during the last War Council meeting. Hubert groaned and rolled his eyes. How could he forget? Constance had somehow managed to stretch what should have been a 5-minute proposal about a potential distraction tactic that could be used into a 30-minute diatribe that wove in her last magical experiments. Some absurd scheme about turning the enemy horses purple? Yet another indignant rant about the fall of House Nouvelle, immediately followed by morose, self-deprecating ramblings when Caspar had unthinkingly opened the curtains to the window behind Constance, momentarily blasting the grimoire with sunshine. Hubert was not certain at what point in Constance's meandering tirade that he had drifted off, but he did clearly remember the grimoire's offended shrieking startling him awake. He had jumped from his chair, dagger in one hand and readying a miasma spell in the other, thinking Constance's shrill scream was a response to someone attacking the attendance of the War Council meeting. Hubert's dramatic reaction had incited a number of responses, namely amused snickering, Dorothea and Petra being the prime offenders, and exasperated sighs. Lady Edelgard's glower of disapproval had immediately made him shrink back in his seat. That woman's nonsensical rabblings could lull the most irate of beasts to sleep, Hubert huffed. Ferdinand chuckled at the comment. Are you insinuating that you are rather beastly? Ferdinand said in an unusually smoky voice. His perfectly groomed eyebrows lifted in a way that made heat crawl up Hubert's neck. Amber eyes gazing at the mage with a look that could almost be described as sultry. Hubert awkwardly cleared his throat, his eyes carefully averted from his companion. Scalding fire blazed across his cheeks. Just a small bit of hyperbole. Nothing more. A small stammer had slithered into Hubert's voice. Despite the constant flutters in chest and flares of heat across his skin that he repeatedly had to quash, spending time with Ferdinand had provided Hubert with the first moments of peace he had felt in a long time. Just having the holy knight near him eased the embers that burned in his nerves and calmed the storm that surged in his mind. Even riding the blasted mare was tolerable with his present company. As if reading his thoughts, said mare began winding off course away from the trail. Hubert glowered as he redirected her. Hubert, she is only reacting to your moods, Ferdinand said with a tone and look of disapproval. Hubert grunted and tugged on the reins, all but yanking the mare back onto the correct path, and huffed at the paladin before him. Are you telling me you are able to read the minds of these flea-ridden beasts, just like Marianne? Nothing quite so impressive, that I assure you. Ferdinand chuckled. He slowed down his own horse so that he was in step with Hubert. Horses are very sensitive. The tone of your voice, your breathing, even the tension you carry in your muscles. Bella can sense all that. She is only acting out because she is picking up on your anxiety. Well, that and the fact that you clearly have a low opinion of her." Ferdinand's last words were said with a large pout. "And what could possibly make her think I have a low opinion of her?" Hubert groused. "Well, you have threatened to feed her to a wyvern on at least 3 separate occasions." Hubert huffed again in response. Bella whinnied, jerking her head sharply in yet another attempt to tear the reins out of the mage's hands. "How about we give her some treats once we return to the monastery? My mother taught me a great recipe for one that uses hollowed-out apples filled with oats and grated carrots. I can show you how they're made. Perhaps that will convince Bella that, beneath your grumpy exterior, is someone who is one of the sweetest, most caring people I have had the pleasure of working with," Ferdinand suggested with a small, warm smile. The mage shot him a withering look. "If you're going to jest, at least make the comment somewhat plausible. Besides, the last time I tried to hand-feed one of these brutes, I nearly lost a finger." Ferdinand snickered. "Fear not, for you have the great Ferdinand von Eyre to assist you in your equestrian duties. In no time you will have a bond with your horse that even the knights of Fargus would be envious of." "That would be quite the feat, considering the absolute abysmal state of my riding abilities," Hubert scoffed. As if to reinforce his point, Bella jerked her head again and whinnied in agreement. Ferdinand frowned. "Your equestrian skills are far from as horrendous as you claim them to be. You are already quite skilled with basic maneuvers. If we could just build your confidence, and your rapport with the horses too, of course, I believe you could make a fine paladin, perhaps even a dark knight." "You sound like the professor," Hubert muttered, as their horses plodded forwards. "I believe Yuritsa and Lorenz already have that field covered. Not to mention, I am already perfectly capable of serving the Imperial Army in my current position as a Dark Bishop. And, in the unlikely event that I find my magic reserve drains, or I am targeted by a silencing spell, I have my lance skills to fall back on. Focusing my efforts towards Dark Knight certification would be nothing but superfluous." "That may be, but a Dark Knight is a versatile unit within the army. Using a horse would offer you a lot more mobility on the battlefield." Ferdinand smiled wistfully, pink dusting his cheeks. "Just think, we could ride into battle together, the contrast of light and dark swirling together. We would be a pair of glittering gems, emulating the radiance of the sun and the moon." Ferdinand's saccharine descriptions aside, the scenario he painted did sound appealing to Hubert. One thing that had distressed Hubert since the two had grown closer was his inability to keep up with Ferdinand on the battlefield. It was clear that their combat styles synergized well with one another and, as a result, the professor often had them working as a team. Unfortunately, it was not unusual for Ferdinand to charge ahead, often recklessly, leaving the mage to sprint after him. By the time Hubert would catch up, pins stabbing into his muscles and gasping for air, Ferdinand would have either eliminated the enemy he was after, or the Holy Knight would be perilously surrounded. On the bright side, Hubert's cardio endurance had never been better. A tempting thought, but regrettably, I am preoccupied with duties elsewhere. Hubert shook his head dismissively, causing Ferdinand to frown. "That is unfortunate, for I rather enjoy fighting by your side, and had thought the both of us being on horseback would further facilitate such opportunities." Hubert tried to ignore the small cartwheel his heart performed. "By the way," Ferdinand continued, "Sylvain said he was attempting the Dark Knight certification exam, and that you were assisting him with studying for the reason magic portion of the exam." Hubert groaned, his face once again finding itself in the palm of his hand. "I'm afraid Sylvain's statement was greatly exaggerated. My assistance ended when my request to annul my teaching duties was granted." "That is a shame," said Ferdinand, his brow furrowed. "It sounded as if you helped him a lot. He spoke quite highly of your tutelage during our mission at the Fargus border." Hubert had to resist the urge to groan once more. Of course Sylvain would try to drag Ferdinand into this disaster. Although Hubert had to admit that working with the former Fargus Knight was not nearly as unpalatable as he predicted. Still, he had no desire to endure Gautier's antics any longer than necessary. "So, this spot you mentioned with its magnificent view, is it nearby?" Ferdinand asked, changing the subject. It was at this point Hubert realized that they were perilously close to the trail that would lead up the Ogma Mountains. He could feel the color draining from his face, and his stomach and chest began fluttering for an entirely different reason. While conversing with Ferdinand, he had been able to shove their inevitable destination to the back of his mind. However, the mountain now loomed overhead, a towering monolith that could no longer be ignored. Yes, the footpath is there, just ahead. If Ferdinand noticed how much Hubert's voice shook, he gave no outward sign. They brought their horses to a stop at the foot of the trail, tethering the animals to a nearby tree. Ferdinand gazed up at the trail leading into the mountain range, a grin already beginning to form. Incredible! I had no idea this trail existed. However did you manage to find it? Ferdinand beamed. His smile was almost enough to ease Hubert's trepidation. The sight of his smile was almost enough to ease Hubert's trepidation. Almost. The location was provided by one of my scouts. He insists that the view it leads to is something most spectacular. You mean you have not seen it yourself yet? Ferdinand asked, incredulous. I merely thought that we could experience it together, for the first time. Hubert forced a smile as he choked out the words. There was no way he was going up that mountain twice. Well, consider me honored to be sharing this wondrous sight with you, Ferdinand cheered, already marching up the path. Hubert grimaced, already noticing how steeply the trail inclined. Releasing a heavy sigh, he hiked up the path after his companion. The trail wove through the mountains, situated far enough away from the cliff faces that Hubert could pretend that they were not steadily climbing hundreds of meters above the forest below. His legs ached as he trekked along the serpentine path. Tall grass tangled around his ankles. The path was lined with sheer rock faces and the occasional wilted pine tree that stubbornly grew through the harsh earth. The climb was a constant, curving incline. The muscles in Hubert's legs screamed, and it did not take long for him to start panting. Ferdinand, on the other hand, showed no signs of distress. In fact, the other man practically skipped along the trail, humming to himself. A silver lance was strapped to Ferdinand's back. As a precaution, Hubert had a tome clipped to his own belt. The Ogma Mountains were largely peaceful. However, skirmishes with stray brigands and animal attacks were not unheard of. Eventually, they reached the clearing that looked out over the Aramid River. Ferdinand immediately ran to the cliff's edge, gasping in wonder. The vivid glow of the sun's rays, tangled with the man's hair, giving the impression he were wreathed in flames. The worry lines that had carved their way into the Holy Knight's skin as the war progressed had vanished, replaced with a carefree joy that caused the mage's heart to ache. Ferdinand turned to Hubert with a bright smile that made the mage's skin tingle. The sight of Ferdinand's unmasked delight was every bit as beautiful as Hubert had imagined. If only he had been able to witness such a sight, somewhere that was not the top of a damn mountain. Come closer, Hubert! The view is absolutely radiant from here. Oh, the way the waves of the setting sun brush against the rolling hills, the blankets of forests below, the sparkling rivers in the distance. It is nothing short of splendor. You must see it from your own eyes. I can see the splendor just fine from where I stand. Hubert grimaced, devoting far more energy than should have been needed to keep his voice from pitching. He clenched his fists until the knuckles had turned numb. His back pressed up against a nearby tree, about as far away from the treacherous ledge as Hubert could possibly get. Objectively, Hubert knew the view would be lovely to most. The sky, shaded gold from the setting sun, stretched before his eyes. Shimmers of dying rays peeked from behind the cotton clouds. If Hubert worked the courage to venture closer to the edge, he would likely see the Aramid River, winding among the emerald plains of Leicester and Adrestia like a diamond serpent. Instead, Hubert kept his back flat against the tree, trying to stifle the hyperventilating breaths that threatened to erupt from his lungs. It was ridiculous. Hubert could not even see the tops of the trees below from where he stood. But he knew he was far higher up than he should be. He could still feel the pressure shift in the air, how the wind felt just the tiniest bit colder. Memories of a foolish, young boy who had tried to chase an impossible dream, and almost ended up as a red smear on the ground as a result, flashed through his mind. Ferdinand followed a ledge to a set of trees. He peered through the branches and grinned, waving over to Hubert. "It appears there is a footpath that continues on even farther. We should venture on and see where it leads." "No, absolutely not. It is getting rather late, don't you think?" Hubert stuttered. "We do not know what beasts may lurk in this area of night. Perhaps we should return to the monastery." His eyes kept darting to the trail leading down the mountain, praying that Ferdinand would somehow take note of Hubert's silent plea to return to the monastery. "Nonsense! The evening has barely started, and I am sure if anything does dare to attack, it will be nothing the two of us cannot handle." Ferdinand grinned, already marching up the narrow path. "And just think of what new magnificent views we may uncover!" Hubert's stomach plummeted. With a shaky breath, he followed Ferdinand up the void-forsaken trail that led even higher. Compared to what they had climbed to reach their original destination, the path they ascended could hardly be classified as a trail. Shrubs and branches reached across their path, as if nature itself was trying to tell them to turn back, a warning Hubert desperately hoped Ferdinand would eventually heed. Furthermore, unlike the previous trail, which had steep rock faces on both sides blocking Hubert's view of the ever-shrinking ground, this trail was only feet away from the sheer drop of the cliff's edge. One wrong step, and what's left of his corpse would need to be scraped off the rocks below. Sweat beaded along his forehead and dripped down his skin in slimy rivets. His chest pounded, his heart threatening to burst through his ribs. He had given up on any semblance of controlling his breathing, air escaping his lungs in jagged gasps. At one point, Hubert's gaze floated to the ledge. The ground below, so terribly far away, spiraled and blurred before his eyes. He clung to a nearby branch to keep himself from pitching forward. Ferdinand cast a worried look over his shoulder. "Hubert, are you well?" "Fine, just fine," he bit out, twisting his face into a near-manic grin. Ferdinand frowned. "Let us return to the monastery. You look rather pale." "I am always pale." Hubert's foot slipped on a loose rock. He lost his balance and began to stumble. Clenching his eyes shut, he waited for the fall. "Hubert!" Strong arms wrapped around him, holding him upright. Hubert cracked an eye open. Ferdinand's hands rested on Hubert's arms, preventing the mage from falling. He looked over his companion. Amber eyes brimmed with worry. Normally, Ferdinand's proximity, the man's face inches away from his own, still being held in his arms, would be a moment of joy for Hubert, the type of intimacy and closeness the parts of his mind that he had tried burying time and time again desperately craved. Instead, he stood frozen, trapped on the accursed cliff, a rabbit cornered by a wolf. Chills ran down his arms and legs. His eyes were wide as he continued to hyperventilate. He tried not to look at the ledge of the cliff, but his eyes always seemed to roam back to the cliff's edge, as if the treacherous ledge was some sort of beacon. The aramid looked like a thin tendril of hair from where he stood. The villages were small dots on the horizon. Everything blurred. High. High. Too high. Far too high. This was a mistake. Never should have come here. A small whine escaped his mouth. Ferdinand gently rubbed soothing circles along Hubert's arms, easing the tremors that ran along them. Hubert had not even realized he had been shaking. "Let us return home," Ferdinand whispered sympathetically, every feature in his face conveying worry. "Here, take my arm." Hubert nodded shakily, letting Ferdinand guide him down the path. A creak sounded from the trees nearby. Hubert whipped his head in the direction of the sound. His eyes squinted at the foliage and the shadows it cast. Nothing. Hubert held his breath and crept forward. Every instinct in his body screamed. He unhooked the tome that was latched to his belt. At his side, Ferdinand had drawn the lance that had been hooked to his back. He cast a wary look at Hubert before tiptoeing forward. An ear-splitting screech filled the air, instantly followed by a tornado of feathers. A giant hawk, the size of a large bull, burst from the trees, its massive wingspan comparable to that of a wyvern, stretched open. The flapping wings created a gust strong enough to shove the mage backwards. He tried to brace himself against the hostile wind. Hubert whimpered as he felt himself sliding towards the ledge. Ferdinand grabbed his arm, preventing the mage from toppling over the cliff. The gauntleted hand dug into his arm. He rammed the blade of his lance into the ground with his free hand, staking it in place and using it as a tether. The hawk shrieked and raged and dove towards the two men. Before Hubert could react, Ferdinand shoved the mage out of the hawk's path. Hubert landed heavily on the ground with a loud grunt. His eyes went wide, and he screamed in horror as his companion was knocked off the ledge. "Ferdinand!" Hubert cried as he scrambled to the ledge. Half a foot below, Ferdinand clung to a protruding branch. He looked up at Hubert, his eyes wide and fearful. The branch, a brittle, half-dead thing, creaked and started to snap. Hubert grasped Ferdinand's arm with both hands, hanging on tightly. He made the mistake of looking past Ferdinand to the forests down far below. His breath clumped in his chest. Swallowing felt like nails were being poured down his throat. The world began to tilt and slide. "Hubert!" Ferdinand's cry jolted Hubert back to his senses. He shook his head, focusing his eyes on Ferdinand's face, and pulled his companion to safety. Behind him, he could hear the colossal hawk circling around, preparing to strike again. He had just dragged Ferdinand safely back to the ledge, when sharp talons dug into his shoulders, the claws slicing deep into his flesh. Hubert screamed as he felt himself being carried away. Everything cartwheeled and spun. His vision blurred. He did not know which way was up. The sensation of wire wrapping around his lungs and squeezing slammed into him. Hubert's breathing was a chorus of panicked wheezes. He was being carried higher into the air. It was the Pegasus incident all over again. No, no, no! Too high, too high, too high! From below, Hubert could barely make out two voices. Two? Only he and Ferdinand were on the mountain, crying out to him. A barrage of arrows forged of light spiraled at the bird. Sajida! But Ferdinand didn't know that spell. Striking its massive wings, the giant hawk shrieked and released its hold on its prey. Hubert's eyes went wide. A scream choked his throat. His lungs, stomach, and heart were lumps of lead. He barely had time to process the trees below surging towards him. He was no longer in the air. The ground was cool beneath his face and hands. It was difficult to focus on anything, his vision melting into nondescript sludge. Pain ensnared his whole body, but he had no idea from where it had originated. His stomach was a whirlpool of nausea that threatened to bubble up at any time. A shrill chorus of tinnitus smothered his ears. He felt, more than heard, the sets of armored boots rushing to his side. "Hubert! Hubert, please say something!" "Looks like he hit his head pretty badly." "Goddess, this is all my fault. If I had not insisted on venturing further—" "Hey, would you calm down? Hubert's going to be fine. He just needs to be patched up a bit." Armored hands pulled him upright. The blurred outline of an armored man with long hair faded in and out of his vision. A gauntleted hand gently touched his face, tilting his head to the side. The movement pushed the maelstrom in his stomach to its peak. Hubert emptied its contents. He vaguely heard what may have been a worried shout claw its way past the shrill ringing in his ears, and the sound of his own retching. Everything went black. Awareness returned with the sluggishness of an armored unit traversing a thick bog. His thoughts were a tangled ball of yarn that refused to relinquish its knots. Every bone in his body ached. His flesh felt like a tapestry of bruises. Sharp pain sunk deep into his shoulders and seeped across his arms. Thick cotton and scalding blades dueled in his skull. The foul taste of bile clung to the insides of his mouth. Hubert blinked awake, with the sensation that he was moving. It was dark, but even the limited illumination cast by the moon and stars were searing, hot coals against his eyes. He squeezed them shut with a pained moan. Armored edges dug into his legs and chest. It took him several moments to realize he was being carried, his chin resting on someone's shoulder, the rest of his body draped over the person's back. His head bobbled gently with each step his carrier took. Carefully, Hubert opened his eyes a sliver and squinted ahead. Much of his vision remained a blur, but what he could see was obscured by a shock of bright, red hair. Ferdinand, Hubert mumbled into the armored shoulder, resting his cheek against the cool metal. Hey, you finally awake back there? Piped a voice that was certainly not Ferdinand's. Hubert groaned upon hearing the one voice that could possibly make the situation worse. Why are you here? Hubert grumbled, lifting his face from the shoulder. First of all, you're welcome, Sylvain snapped, shooting an angry look over his shoulder at the mage still slumped against his back. If I hadn't shown up, you would have been chewed up and regurgitated into a tasty snack for a nest of baby birds by now. You did not answer my question. I saw you and Ferdinand take off towards the mountains, and someone had to make sure your date didn't go off a cliff, though I wasn't expecting that concern to end up being so literal. So you thought it was acceptable to spy on us during a private moment? Hubert hissed. I thought the long list of salacious accusations attached to your name were merely hyperbolic rumors sprung from the vapid, philandering persona you insisted on projecting during our academy days. Though it would seem that you are not above voyeurism at all. Hey, Sylvain snapped, I was only there to make sure you didn't say or do something to cause your date to crash and burn. I was going to leave when things got steamy. I'm not a pervert. And I suppose you've graciously volunteered to hold me back to Garrick-Mach like a weather-beaten rucksack. Hubert muttered, still draped across the knight's back. The mage's limbs felt as if they were made of jelly. His skull carried the sensation that it was being used as a blacksmith's anvil. Hey, I tried convincing Ferdinand to carry you. I figured you'd much prefer waking up in his strapping arms. Hubert could practically hear the infuriating wink in Sylvain's voice. But he insisted on going ahead and scouting for danger. He was pretty upset about the hawk fiasco. He kept blaming himself and saying going further up the mountain was his idea. A tangle of distorted images and sounds were the only snippets Hubert could recover as he thought about the hawk attack. The last clear memory he had was of the beast snatching him in its sharp talons and carrying him away from Ferdinand. Numbly, Hubert took note of the deep gashes in his shoulders. Through the syrupy haze coating his mind, Hubert could vaguely hear how Ferdinand and Sylvain had managed to stop the bird from fleeing with its prey. However, the ensuing attack had resulted in Hubert being dropped from a sizable distance and crashing into several tree branches on his way down. You were pretty out of it by the time we got to you. Ferdinand had just started checking your injuries when you threw up and passed out. With horror, Hubert's fragmented memories pieced together an all too familiar shadowy silhouette that had been kneeling before him seconds before he had lost consciousness, one that was certainly centered in the trajectory of the stomach contents he had been forced to expel. Wait, I did not. Hubert paled, feeling himself turn ill once more. Puke on your date? Yep, you did, Sylvain snickered. Don't worry, I've seen worse. Besides, Ferdinand's a hardened soldier. He's not going to care about getting a little vomit on his armor. Plus, he was too busy worrying that you were going to die in his arms. Hubert made a noise that was a muffled combination of a groan and a growl. Put me down. I have a functioning pair of legs that can carry me the rest of the way. Sylvain glanced over his shoulder and lifted an eyebrow. You sure? Ferdinand and I patched you up a bit, but we only had a couple of vulneraries and neither of us are great at healing. You're still in pretty rough shape. Down! Hubert barked, squirming his limbs out of Sylvain's grasp. Okay, Saint Saros' tits. You're trying to help a guy. Sylvain grumbled, dropping to a knee so that Hubert could slide off his back. Hubert stumbled to his feet. The world spun momentarily, his balance wobbling. After a moment, his head and vision cleared enough to see the trail ahead. With slow, shaky steps, he moved forward. Sylvain stayed close to his side, eyeing him warily. By the way, next time I suggest a way for you to woo Ferdinand, maybe, just maybe, tell me when you're afraid of whatever I'm suggesting, the knight huffed. Hubert suppressed a wince, keeping his face carefully blank. I do not know what you speak of. Oh, for the love of... Would you cut it with the fake, I do not know what you speak of act? Sylvain hissed. "It's painfully obvious you're terrified of heights." Sylvain glared back at the knight, both for the accurate accusation and the poor imitation of the mage's voice once more. "Continue this line of inquiry, and you may not like where it leads," Hubert hissed lowly, in a tone he reserved for those he interrogated. "So that wasn't you screaming at an octave I didn't know existed? Did you incur a head injury as well? If I do not remember, I was being attacked," Hubert snarled. "Or was I supposed to remain politely silent while a feral hawk carried me off to be devoured? I'm not your damn enemy. Would you quit acting like I'm going to stab you in the back the second you show even a sliver of vulnerability? Fine, I am anxious around tall heights. Is that what you wanted to hear?" Hubert spat, frustration reverberating through his body. "And I had best never hear of this conversation being repeated elsewhere." Sylvain's glare immediately vanished. He chuckled and drew the mage into another lopsided, one-armed hug. "See, that wasn't so hard." Hubert scowled and wriggled his way out of the knight's grasp. Only about one blissful minute of silence lasted between the two, before Sylvain spoke again. "So, was it a horse you fell off of?" "What?" Hubert barked, brows furrowed with confusion. "Your fear of heights. Did you get it from falling off a horse?" Hubert scoffed and glared at his companion. "A horse is not so high. What sort of delicate fop do you take me for if you believe my uneasiness around heights stems from something so trivial?" "Well, you seem pretty uneasy and terrible when riding a horse." "My distaste for equestrian activities and my phobia are mutually exclusive. Not all of us went straight from the womb to the saddle of a horse." "Are you sure about that? 'Cause it was not a horse I fell off of." "It was a Pegasus," Hubert muttered, hanging his head and hoping his bangs would cover at least some of the red tinging his face. "Really?" Sylvain snickered. "You do realize they only let women and girls ride them, right?" "Yes, well, if you could travel back in time and kindly pass that valuable information on to my 5-year-old self, that would be much appreciated." Hubert bristled. Sylvain's laughter doubled. "Well, I can't wait to tell Ingrid. Is what I would say if I was a terrible person who can't keep their mouth shut. I was just kidding," Sylvain hastily added, once Hubert sent him a glare sharp enough to flay skin. Sylvain held up his hands defensively. "I swear I wasn't going to say anything. Look," Sylvain's expression turned serious. "You didn't give me a hard time when I froze up around that demonic beast earlier, so I'm definitely not going to be an ass about your fear of heights." "I thank you," Hubert replied with a tiny smirk. Sylvain smiled back. After a moment, he held out the arrow of Indra that he had been carrying to Hubert. "Guess I should return this to you. Gotta say, it packs a hell of a punch." Hubert stared at the offered lance for a moment, then shook his head. "Keep the blasted thing. For now, at least, I believe you will make more use of it than I will. After all, you will need a suitable weapon if you are to pursue your goals of becoming a Dark Knight." "Wow, thanks. So, guess this means you're going to help me with reason magic after all?" asked Sylvain with a small, hopeful grin. "Think of it more as a token of understanding that what transpired here today will not be repeated," Hubert grimaced. He could feel a small, wry grin begin to take shape on his face. "Hey, as I said, my lips are sealed." "Hubert!" Both men turned to see Ferdinand sprinting up the hill towards them. Ferdinand barreled towards Hubert, nearly knocking the other man over as he all but tackled him into a tight hug. Hubert winced at the impact, but quickly returned the embrace. Although the chinks of metal digging into his torso were not the most comfortable, the sensation of being held tightly by the other man filled him with bliss he had never experienced before. Even through the tunic and chilled armor, Hubert could feel the warmth radiating from Ferdinand's body. The sound of the man's breaths against his shoulder, more captivating than any aria. Hubert nuzzled his face into Ferdinand's shoulder. His eyes fluttered shut. He could have drifted off to sleep, standing there at the base of the Ogma Mountains, wrapped in Ferdinand's arms. After a moment, Ferdinand pulled away. He cupped Hubert's face in his hands, looking over the mage with a stricken expression. "By the goddess, you had me so worried! Are you well? How are your memories? You seemed quite disoriented when I found you. Is anything broken? What about sprains? You fell from quite a distance, are you— Easy, Ferdinand. Let the man breathe, Sylvain interrupted with a small grin. My apologies, Ferdinand replied in a sheepish manner, a slight blush dusting his cheeks. Hubert smiled warmly at his companion. I suspect I may have a concussion, but besides that, I am well. Thanks to you, of course. Ferdinand's smile vanished, his brows furrowed, and his eyes became downcast. And yet, I am the reason you were so hurt in the first place. Hubert's eyes drifted to the front of Ferdinand's coat. He grimaced, seeing a large vomit stain across the fabric. I do apologize for the mess I made. The mage winced, gesturing to the unseemly dark patch. Hubert! Ferdinand's face turned indignant. I care not about some silly bit of fabric. You almost died out there, and it would have been my fault. Hey, would you both calm down? Everything's okay in the end, right? Sylvain cut in cheerfully, draping an arm over each of the other men and pulling them into a clumsy group hug. Ferdinand's bubbling panic noticeably deflated, while Hubert bristled. Nobody ended up bird food, and Manuela will have the bump on Hubie's head fixed in no time. Sylvain continued in a light tone. Yes, it is most fortuitous that Sylvain happened to be in the area on a scouting mission, Ferdinand declared, beaming at the other knight. Yes, very. Hubert scowled at Gautier, who only continued to grin in response. The trio slowly picked their way down the remainder of the mountain trail. Hubert had his arms looped around the crook of Ferdinand's, the holy knight insisting that the mage lean on him for support. Sylvain kept sending the pair mischievous grins, ones that Hubert returned with cold glares, while Ferdinand remained oblivious to the exchange, preoccupied with keeping an eye out for danger. They eventually reached their horses, tethered to the trees at the base of the mountain. Sylvain tethered Hubert's mare to his own horse to lead back to the monastery, while Hubert, on the insistence of both knights, shared a horse with Ferdinand. The ride back to Garreg Mach was a haze. Hubert's head still swam. The sensation of knives chiseling his skull reverberated through his temples and across his brow. Pain from the gashes in his shoulders and the bruises marring his torso began to sting more incessantly. His ears rang. The starlight burned his eyes, and his stomach still insisted on performing a series of acrobatic routines. He scrunched his eyes shut and rested his face on Ferdinand's back, his arm wrapped around the other man. The steady rise and fall of Ferdinand's back with each breath was Hubert's only distraction from the gnawing aches that engulfed his body. Eventually, they arrived at the monastery. The three slid off their respective saddles, with Ferdinand offering Hubert a hand and gently guiding the mage off the horse and safely onto the ground. Sylvain approached the two men. Hey, Ferdinand, let me take your horse to the stable. You stay with Hubert and make sure he gets to the infirmary. Don't want him passing out on the way there, after all, Sylvain said with a wink. The Fargus knight took off with the horses without another word and scurried towards the stable, leaving Hubert and Ferdinand alone by the monastery gates. After a moment's pause, Ferdinand offered his arm once more and began leading Hubert towards the infirmary. They walked across the courtyard in silence, their footsteps echoing in the dark, and the hum of crickets were the only noises. It was not until they entered the main lobby of the monastery that Ferdinand spoke. Hubert, why did you not tell me of your fear of heights? I would have never insisted on further exploring the mountain had I known, said Ferdinand, his face stricken. Hubert sighed, still hanging on to the other man for support. Normally, this would be where Hubert would begin vehemently denying the accusation of having such a phobia. He would suggest the inquirer was delusional, or, if all else fails, start issuing threats. But every bone and muscle in his body screamed for rest. Even his mind was struggling to stay afloat in a sea of fatigue. I suppose there's no sense in denying it at this point, Hubert muttered. I apologize for my undignified reaction. I should have been able to handle a mere hike up a mountain in a more appropriate manner. I do not think I have ever seen you so frightened before. Ferdinand frowned. Forgive me. I did not mean to bring up an uncomfortable subject. It is no matter. I should have been forthright about my discomfort concerning higher elevations in the first place. If that's the case, why did you suggest climbing the mountain in the first place? Ferdinand asked, with a worried furrow in his brow. "Do not get me wrong. The view was every bit as spectacular as you described. But I do not wish to see you distressed on my account. I suppose I thought I could handle my reactions." Hubert sighed. "It is not unusual for me to be forced into a situation where I am forced to navigate heights in some capacity. Besides, I knew your enjoyment of grand views, and I thought it would be discourteous to deny you the pleasure of experiencing this one." "Really?" Ferdinand's eyes went wide. "I do not know what to say. I am touched by your thoughtfulness, but next time let us go somewhere that we will both enjoy." "I can agree to those terms." Hubert returned Ferdinand's grin with a half-smile. He tried to ignore the annoying flutter in his chest of Ferdinand's promise of a next time. After a few moments, they reached their destination. The infirmary door was closed, and Manuela's snores could be heard from the other side. Nonetheless, both of them knew that she would never turn away from an injured student, no matter the time of night. "Well, here we are," Ferdinand announced. He unhooked his arm from Hubert's, but still held onto the other man's hand. The two of them stood there together, neither of them moving, hands still linked with one another. Ferdinand stared at him, as if waiting for the mage to speak first. It was the perfect opportunity. The flutters in his chest turned thunderous, demanding to break free. After the complete disaster of their cliffside hike, Ferdinand was still beside him, still watching Hubert, with eyes swirling with affection. Surely that had to mean something. "Say something, you fool!" Hubert internally screamed at himself. "I thank you for everything tonight," Hubert ended up saying with about as much grace as an inebriated duck. The internal voice wailed at Hubert's ineptitude to say anything meaningful to the other man. Regardless, Ferdinand smiled warmly in return and squeezed his hand. Warmth raced up Hubert's arm at the touch. With that, Ferdinand took Hubert's arm once more and guided him inside. Even a trip to the infirmary did not feel so dreadful with Ferdinand's warmth beside him. Perhaps their cliffside outing had not been a complete disaster after all.